So enough from me. The last thing I want to do here is introduce my colleague, Peter Smith. And one of the things I want to tell you is that if you want to build a different type of company, a different type of product, you need a different type of head of product. So most head of product management, they're a lot more like me. They spent their whole life in vendor land, worked for software companies. But that's actually not Peter. Peter's actually been a lot more like most of you. Peter's built from scratch 4 data centers, 4 corporate data centers, and everything in them. We're talking about implementing and deploying EMC, NetApp, HP backends, VMware, Citrix, Oracle front ends. So Peter really knows this stuff, and he's walked in the shoes of an administrator, and largely was driven the how do we build the interface and what's the problem we really, really want to focus in on has been things that Peter's seen from his own career. And we think that's really important if you're going to deliver on customer experience, actually having people who are like your customers calling the shots on what your product's going to look and act like. Couple fun facts about Peter. Turns out he's an excellent musician. He's actually been a professional paid musician in the past and went to college fully on a music scholarship, so really a multi-talented guy. And he's also a power marathoner. So this year he's run 1,500 miles. I compare that to
We hate him already.
Yeah, I was going to say I've run less than 1,500 meters this year. So, I'm nothing in comparison.
That was just because you were being chased.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, you know where Columbia is.
Yeah.
Great neighborhood.
Yeah. So it's my honor and my pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Peter Smith. He's going to show you and tell you what we're up to as Infinio. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks again. And, 16 months ago, I was an IT administrator and recognized a problem that I wanted to solve, which is why I came to Infinio. The goal is to build a product for us, IT administrators. And I think what you'll find is that throughout the entire experience of the product, that's what you're going to get. So the solution is to separate storage performance from the capacity layer so that you can actually buy performance, not disk. And the way we do that is with what we call downloadable storage performance.
Quoting George.
There are a lot of edge caching solutions, and of course SSD being one of them. But from my prerogative, to have the kind of user experience that I come to expect from enterprise IT software, we need a fully downloadable performance acceleration solution that does not rely on SSDs. And that's what Infinio is, a NAS accelerator, in software only. So traditional upgrade path, you're all very familiar with it. Our upgrade path, probably do some Google searches for VMware slow NFS, winds up to one of your blogs. There's a post around Infinio, you're kind of interested. So you go to the website, download our software, double click, and you're up and running. It does the discovery of your environment, does the deployment of the accelerators, the inlining process, you're good to go. One click to deploy the accelerator. So once you've done the installation, if you've got another data store that you want to deploy, there's a single button. It says accelerate, you click it, done. And you get to see results right away. We don't just give you a plugin into vCenter. It's not just a single line graph. It actually tries to tell you what the value is that we're delivering, put it in terms that make sense to administrators, and really highlight what we do for you. And we'll show you that pretty soon. So with that, why don't we just jump right into it? So as I was saying, probably landed on your blog, and that's what motivated you to go to Infinio's website. Now this is not the Infinio website that you see today. The site that you see today is more for recruiting. So this is actually the first time anybody has actually seen the new brand of Infinio that will launch when we go public. The first thing you'll notice here, though, is that front and center is a download button. And we mean it. You click that button, you get software. It's not 14 inputs. You don't have to tell your mother's maiden name or anything like that. You're not going to get a call from an inside sales rep just so you can get the software. You just click the button. The next thing you'll probably notice is how quick that was to download. This Infinio setup, it's 28 megabytes. That's it. Downloads in probably about 8 seconds. So now we launch it. Click run. And this is the installer. There's a video actually built into the installer to explain what it does to your infrastructure, how it's going to make changes, and what you should come to expect from the installer, which we're actually going to go through later on once we get into sort of the how it works, nuts and bolts. So even I have to agree to the EULA, so will everybody else. So we put in our vCenter credentials, rather vCenter. Does a discovery of hosts, data stores, everything that's pertinent to Infinio. And we're presented with a filtered list of data stores. In this case, I only have one there for the purpose of the demo. But if you had a longer list, you could actually just put in the name of it and it would search through the list. Nice little convenience feature. This next step is to validate your environment to make sure that you have sufficient resources to run Infinio. We require 8 gigs of memory per host, which in the day and age of 128 gig boxes and larger, it's not that much. We assign 2 vCPUs to each accelerator engine, but under normal working loads, we typically only use about half of those resources. And 15 gigs of local disk space. So now it's going through each one of your ESX hosts and validating that you have these resources available. And it presents you with a summary. It's validated your network topology. It's validated your ESXi versions and default configurations. And it also presents you with information about what your resource usage is like, whether you have reservations that would starve Infinio of resources, just basically letting you know that we've made sure everything's OK. The next part is a management VM. So I think what you'll find interesting here is that we put an Infinio Accelerator on each ESX host. And there's one management VM as well. But we're only ever going to ask you for one IP address. So we've got this distributed storage engine, and yet you only have to put one IP address into the entire system. And we'll get into how we do that in just a minute. But now, it gives you a summary of all of your ESX hosts, lets you see what free space, free memory, and CPU looks like, so you can decide which host you want to place the management console on.
I see your hosts are as busy as mine.
Now you can select a data store, and it filters the data store based on what is available to the host that you selected for the management console. And then it prompts you for the network that you want to put the management console on. So in this case, we'll go with management network. Just going to name it console. Everything looks good. Choose a admin username and password, which I hope to remember so I can get back in. And then the final summary screen tells you what we're going to do. Make sure you selected what you wanted to select. Everything is copacetic. And then we're off to the races. So what this is doing is in the background, it's downloading an OVA, which will be deployed to the host that you selected for the management console. Yep.
Downloading from your website?
Yes, exactly. So we wanted to keep the installer nice and small. From click to download would be around 10 seconds. So we removed the OVA from the actual installer so that when you execute the installer, it's actually going to start buffering the OVA download in the background. So that by the time you get to this part, most of it has already been downloaded, so we can now stream it off.
Okay, so it's downloading from your install client, not from...
Yeah, precisely. You know, that's a great point, and I probably should have brought that up sooner. You can run this installer from your local Mac, your local Windows box, your vCenter server. It doesn't matter where it is. If you're at your workstation,
Except it needs external connectivity, which is a problem sometimes.
That's true. Yep. So your workstation is a great example of it being sort of a bridge between the external world.
Yeah.
You're on your NetOps network, right? Your NetOps network has access to the external world as well as your management infrastructure.
Well, unless you work for no such agency.
Yeah,
There are plenty of examples where that is certainly the case. Yes.
So I can download to a thumb drive and walk it through my air gap?
Yeah, you could certainly take the OVA, download it, and just put it next to the installer, and it'll say, oh, is there the OVA next to the installer? Let's just use that instead of downloading it from the internet. Yeah.
Cool. They can't change security policies of companies. That's outside the scale of what they can do.
I can't change security policies.
But it's, but
they have to recognize that.
Absolutely.
There are
yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
There are products that
I'd love to use
simply
their
won't
product
work
if I
unless they
can't
can get to
actually
the internet.
install it.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
I
it would
don't
make
have
it pretty
internet
tough for you to
access.
use it.
So yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So it's chugging along here.
Yes, Rick has your
One
cheese.
quick question.
Sure.
Is it just works with VMware?
Today it works with VMware only, yes.
And NFS only.
Yeah, yep, and NFS only. Uh-huh.
That's too bad because I could really use something to speed up my Drobo Elite.
Well, the first problem is you have to do
Are there any plans to bring it to block level storage and or
Whatever's
Hyper-V?
free.
It's funny you should mention both in the same sentence because both are, we're sort of weighing the decision between block storage versus multi-hypervisor support.
block storage.
That's your, yeah.
This is my opinion.
Maybe we should take a poll here. Let's see a raise of hands for block
Well, if you're
storage.
going to have that much beer, why don't you just do both?
He's got a good point.
I'm kind of biased to NFS.
Yeah, just double the engineering staff and send them off in parallel. See who gets to the end first. They get the beer.
They get the beer. That's the perfect incentive.
No
So at
one's
this point,
serious using Hyper-V
we're
anyway,
configuring
so
IP
block
addresses
storage.
on the management console. You
Just
can
to be
see.
difficult, Hans wants SMB3.
I already had a bad case of that. Doctor cleared it up. So.
But
How large is the OVA down payload?
Right now, it's I believe it's around 650 megs for the for the Accelerator appliance. So now we sync with vCenter, and you're going to see a flurry of activity here. I'll just sort of bounce between these two screens a little bit. And we'll get into the specifics of what it's doing just a little bit.
So you mentioned it needed 10 gigs of storage. Is it local storage or just data storage?
Yeah, local storage. Yeah,
So you need local storage on your ESX host?
yeah. Today you do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it, and
That's a level of refinement that we're working towards, but it's
Can you explain the reason why you need local storage? Or why do you use local storage for?
so it's a chicken and egg problem. If you put the accelerator on the accelerated data store, you can get yourself in, but once you lose connectivity, how do you ensure that you can reestablish connection through the accelerator that is no longer available? Because you're sitting between the data store, the ESX host. And if the accelerator itself is on the thing that you're accelerating, it's great, you can get it up and running. But what happens when there's an inevitable, like you do a NetApp failover or something like that, then what happens?
yeah, but I should be able to install the accelerator on yet another data store.
Oh, sure, you can certainly do that. Yeah,
Okay,
if
so it
you
doesn't
if you
have
had
to
some
be-
other data stored, that would be acceptable
Well, I mean,
as well.
if I have an NFS system, it's easy enough for me to set up another file system and another data store.
Oh, but the installer looks for local
We'll
storage
get to the
in
specifics
particular, right?
there. Well, actually, we should just talk about it now because we have time. So you would be able to use another data store. Let's say you had an iSCSI LUN that was provisioned. The only requirement is that it not be on the same layer 2 network, the same broadcast domain, the same VM kernel interface that accesses that storage network. So for instance, if you had the 10.1.2 network, and that's where your NFS storage was, and you provisioned something else on the 10.1.2 network that you wanted to host the accelerator on, you couldn't do that. But if you had the 10.2.2 network and another LUN provision from there, that would work just fine. Because presumably you have a separate VM kernel interface accessing that layer 2 network, so you don't have routed topologies to storage.
So one of your 9 buttons allows you to select a different place?
Yeah. So there's that drop down where I originally had selected the
local storage.
Yeah, exactly.
It's that flurry of activity.
There it goes. So maybe we can just talk a little bit about what's going on right now. The way Infinio works is there's a private network that lives on the vSwitch of the VM kernel interface that accesses storage. So that private network is essentially a private VLAN that allows us to communicate over a private channel between the VM kernel interface and us. Now, what happens after that is sort of the trick. Your ESX host thinks it's talking directly to storage, and your storage system thinks it's talking directly to the VM kernel interface. But in reality, Infinio is sitting in the middle, watching NFS traffic pass by, keeping track of what it sees. If it sees something interesting that it thinks, hey, myself or one of my neighbors has the answer to that question, drops it into the communication path, and you didn't have to go to storage to fetch the response. And that, in a nutshell, is what we're doing. And when you think about what this installer process is doing, and this installer is basically stitching together a fully distributed storage acceleration layer. So that if one of your peer nodes is accessing content, and it's important to note this is content, not addresses. So if it accesses content that another node would need in the future, instead of going to storage to fetch that content, it simply asks its neighbor for the content. And I think it's pretty remarkable that such a simple experience can actually stitch together this fully distributed system, and yet doing it with only one IP address. And that's the next part of the equation, which is this private communication that happens across this distributed cluster. It actually occurs over link local addressing, the sort of addresses you would get if you didn't provision or you couldn't access DHCP, for instance. So all of these cluster nodes, they see each other over link local, and they can communicate with each other without having to have specifically assigned IP addresses. Furthermore, the way we do our inlining process and the way the data passes through Infinio, it means that you don't need to update any ACLs on your NFS system. So if you've got ACLs that would specifically target individual IP addresses, not just a net range, right? You're saying the VM kernel interface 1 on host 5 has access to this share, right? Doesn't matter, it'll work. Because we effectively masquerade as the address of the VM kernel interface. So you don't need to make any storage side changes.
What sort of latency does this add for, say, non-cache data?
Yep. So it's well below a millisecond. Now, the key here is to blend that into what we offload and the effects on latency. So a distributed cache hit would be around 1.5 to 2 milliseconds of latency to satisfy the request entirely. So when you blend that into actual backend latency, will improve your latency by 6x, right? So when you factor in a cache miss of increasing latency by, say, a half a millisecond, yet all of the cache hits that we get are reducing it by multiples, it blends out to be, in my belief, a reasonable trade-off. And we'll actually do a demonstration of this. Later on, we're going to kick off a compile farm workload building 15 distinct versions of the Linux kernel concurrently. And on my little Mac here, it sort of struggles along. And then the accelerator kicks in, and you'll see the disparity between front-end blended latency, which is Infinio's acceleration plus cache misses, versus just cache misses, which is a measure of back-end storage latency. And you're going to see a pretty significant difference. So it looks like we're good to go here. All right, so this is our alpha dashboard. We'll get into what the UI is going to be wired up to look like. The reason I'm bringing this up, instead of just jumping to the UI mockups, is because the metrics, collection, reporting, summarization of all of these distributed nodes, all of that internal functioning it's there. It works, and we're actually presenting information in the performance tab right now. But what I'd like to do is show you what the actual GA product will look like. But before I do that, I think we should kick off a workload. And oh, that would be great.
Good, we got you one.
Awesome.
In for you in a few minutes.
Isn't it nice Stephen has flunkies?
I like to call them minions. Or at least minion.
I think that's actually Tom's official title,
Yes.
is Minion.
Head
That
minion.
was the Dread Pirate reference.
Senior distinguished minion.
Well, eventually.
That's at least nicer than what we call him when he's off camera.
learn
That's his
fencing
public
and
name.
important other skills.
How to have 6 fingers on his hand.
Well, no,
As long as they're in
Oh, yeah,
charge
right
of
move,
fetching. Yes.
So this is what the GA product will look like. I'm going to go through the distinct sections, and then we'll jump into a more zoomed-in view. So first off, in the top right corner, it's overall system status. Are there problems? Is everything working? And at a high level, what is your offload rate? The next section, data stores. It's a summary of all of the acceleratable data stores in your environment. Single click to accelerate, that blue button on the right. It'll do the exact same process that I just demonstrated, unless an accelerator is already deployed, in which case it's merely a plumbing problem of getting the traffic to pass through the already deployed accelerator. There's no additional acceleration, and it's very, very fast.
And if for some reason you want to pull the accelerator back, the disable button
Yeah,
pulls it back?
exactly. Yeah, the disable accelerator button.
Does it clean up
Which
networking
notice
as
is
well?
much smaller.
It does, yeah. It removes the port groups and everything.
Very nice.
Needs to be a Joker mod font.
Are you sure?
The next section, this is really just to try and tell you, at our best and at your workload's peak, how much did we offload in terms of the number of 15,000 RPM, 10,000 RPM, or 7,200 RPM drives. So the next section is the Infinio-wide offload, requests offloaded across the entire Infinio installation. And finally, effective cache size. So what is that? Something we haven't talked about is the fact that Infinio is a single instance storage engine. If we see a piece of content, not just an address, we'll store it once. If another piece of content that's exactly the same at a 4K block size comes into the system, it just gets a pointer, and we only store it once. So this tells you what the efficiency score of the system would be. Now we'll jump in a little bit more. Oh, forgot one more thing. We just wanted to be a little playful, and so we included something that we call the brag bar. It's sort of like a vanity metric, to be perfectly honest. It's a total number of offloads that your system has performed at any given point in time that you could tweet out, and it's just fun. So this is the data store view, and we focus on 3 key metrics: response time improved, requests offloaded, and bandwidth saved. So bandwidth saved is important for organizations that have, that don't have 10 gig Ethernet on their controller heads. Requests offloaded speaks for itself, and response time improved is the difference between the blended latency of all cache hits and cache misses versus just cache misses, so the observed latency of the backend storage system. Now, if you click on any one of these, you get an expanded view of historical metrics for the given data store. The top one is without Infinio versus with Infinio. Now, this is an interesting one, because when you offload a significant portion of requests, you can't tell what the latency of the backend storage system would be had you placed the requests on the storage system. So the calculation here is really taking observed latency and applying a correction to it, which is basically saying, based on the offload today and based on our modeling, how much additional load do you think would be offloaded? Okay. Now, when you do this, you can disable that.
You do understand that that correction reduces your credibility. Because one who might be skeptical, like me, might assume that you've built some fudge into that correction factor.
I totally agree, which is why in the information view, which explains the correction factor for a given set of numbers, check a box and it says use only observed.
Okay, and so you'll show me.
It eliminates the without Infinio and replaces it with observed latency.
Right, so it'll be storage system
True
latency
observed latency of the backend.
Effectively, and application
everything is observed. Yep,
okay.
Put
exactly.
Put it
your
in the
name
Howard
in
button.
parentheses underneath it.
Oh yes, it's the Howard button. Okay.
Howard button.
The next one is, it's worth noting that it's the volume of requests in blue versus the percentage that represents of the total. Our goal isn't to be another troubleshooting tool. You can figure out how much workload is going through your storage system with a multitude of tools that you already have. Our goal is to tell you how much work we took off of your system, and that's what this does. We mostly talked about this, but it's really just telling you, quantifying it in terms of how many shelves of disk did you not buy as a result of this. The next is the Infinio-wide statistics. So you can look at it in a 14-day or 16-week view, a spark line to show you the trend over the rolling 24 hours.
Spark lines!
That's the Steven button.
That's the Steven button.
We'll relabel it. And then we already discussed effective
The joys
cache
of
size.
dealing with stealth startups.
And that's that. That is what GA will look like.
I've got 2 quick questions for
Sure,
you.
yeah.
One, the brag bar seems kind of silly. It's not really a question, but it could be a question, is it possible, or would it be possible to disable that?
I think I should take note of that, and we can have a setting that would disable the brag bar.
Okay, because I know in my day job environment, the last thing they want me doing is tweeting about our infrastructure, and I'm probably not the only one in the room or on the audience who's in an environment where you're not supposed to brag about the product you use unless they're approved by legal and
Certainly.
Yeah, when I was at Lehman,
300%.
It's a modest admin.
when I was at Lehman Brothers, which brand of patch cables you used was considered to be competitive advantage, and you couldn't tell anybody.
yeah.
That and just enterprise in general, you have 9 zillion different departments to deal with, and if any one of them says no, it means that we can't put your stuff in.
Yeah, certainly.
So, yeah, we need to make, if you want to go after that market, then you need to be careful to be able to turn off some of the stuff that's fine.
That's
for
great feedback.
SMBs and things.
We will definitely take note of that.
But the more important question is, can we pull this data out of the dashboard and use it elsewhere? Whether it's just exporting reports or pulling out a spreadsheet or CSV or whatever.
So it's funny you mention this because one of our alpha sites literally yesterday asked the exact same question. And my answer today is that our backend is RRD.
Okay.
So conceivably, you could take RRD and load it into something like Cacti or whatever your choice is.
Mm-hmm.
But today, we don't have an export facility to something like Excel.
Okay.
That
Is
would
that
That would be a very
that's a high
desirable
priority,
feature,
yeah.
but
Carrie's
not
taking
a
notes.
showstopper.
Thank you.
Yeah, something like that would plug into, even something that would, I don't know, if you can add it to, because you're sort of in vCenter and you're already in there, so if you can somehow provide the same kind of API hooks that other tools already use to monitor this sort of stuff,
Sure.
then you guys don't have to do a lot of the heavy lifting. You can just get that to whatever tool is already in use. But again, particularly at enterprise, they will be welded to whatever they do now. But that data is really cool because if I'm thinking around things like cost avoidance numbers so that you can actually say, we deployed this tool, it cost X, we have already saved you this much money in cost avoidance over the next 12 months. In terms of just management dashboard things where you show them really simple numbers for end of month, that will make the non-technical people very, very happy. So CFOs and so on.
Yeah.
So do you see this primarily with servers, or do you see this as like a VDI play for desktops?
Yeah, VDI is a great option here. We actually have some VDI numbers that we can share.
Yeah. And for VDI, it would be, a really direct alternative to Ilio. Yeah. The same kind of memory-based caching technology.
And there's a question that came up that from Duncan. Do you guys have any plans to integrate with VCOps?
Our external integrations, we don't have any concrete plans right now, whether it's vCenter or otherwise.
Sorry, Duncan.
I think really, from my perspective, it's trying to understand what the market wants. And I don't really have intuition, nor do I have concrete numbers to tell me whether I should go vCenter or some other direction. So wall clock time for a compile farm. We'll cut to the chase. 4 times speed up. That's what it was. A response time chart for a brand new NetApp filer. So most people would think of Infinio as a play for an overloaded system. And the question of latency came up, and rightfully so. What we find, though, is that the software is so good that it actually reduces latency on a NetApp filer that we literally just pulled the sticker off of. And in some cases, an already high-performing system, 4 milliseconds of latency at peak, cut it in half. The other thing that's notable here is the stability of the line, the black line. It's very stable performance. So you could consider this an application acceleration play as well. VDI, now this is just in our lab using Login VSI, 100 desktops. Clearly it's capturing much of the traffic. And this isn't just boot storms. This is actual real world sort of reading your email, doing operations that Login VSI does. And why don't I go back to the workload and see how that was doing before we jump into the how it works. Oh, it's Megan's birthday.
Happy birthday.
Peter, a question that's just occurred to me. You're accelerating content, so you're able to identify NFS content on the wire.
Yeah,
And
precisely.
intercept, yeah.
Yep.
So, again, I might be mistaken about the technical details, but NFS v3, v4, and higher with encryption.
Yep. So right now we only support NFS v3 via TCP.
Yep.
And we'll sort of move in the direction of the hypervisors. I imagine they will eventually adopt NFS v4, 4.1, but I don't think we'll build that until we have, a real signal from those vendors.
Yeah, okay.
And that's where the encryption really comes into play.
Yeah, I'm also thinking things like PNFS.
Yep,
For certain
absolutely.
workloads. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But remember, it's just a VMware tool, so
Yep.
till VMware takes advantage of those things, wouldn't do them any good to support it anyway.
Agreed, yeah. And most deployments don't bother with things like encryption point-to-point anyway, other than for very specific workloads where they're ultra paranoid about things inside their data center. So I can still see 90% of the time people don't bother. Again, it's in a secure zone anyway, so data intercept is unlikely. But yeah, okay.
So let's see how this is going. If we actually have some numbers here. Okay, so it's going. We should probably talk about what this actually is. There's 15 VMs. Each one is randomly choosing a version of the Linux kernel, version 3.6 and 3.0 and 2.6. And just sort of chugs along. I wanted to choose that workload to show a variety of content. There's a lot of similarity in the content. The code base is obviously very similar. But there's also variations. And how does that actually affect our ability to cache? And as you can see, I mean, we're up to 4,000 operations per second. And it's offloading. Well, you know what? I can tell you exactly what it's offloading. Basically everything. I think we missed 1 or 2 operations. We'll work on that. But
It looks like 2.9 per second.
and yeah, that's the results there.